Public Interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thanks for joining us again this week. This week we focus on something that has been making the rounds, certainly in the media, and it has been affecting certain sections of society, and that has to do with torture. Torture allegedly by some members of the Guyana Police Force. Of course, you know I always refer to Mr. Granger as a security expert. He's here again this week, and he will focus on torture and some of the solutions that himself and the Partnership for National Unity are putting out there. So with me is leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Mike.
All right. Sir, so that we can the first thing we want to do is put today's discussion into focus. Is torture really an illegal form of punishment, not only in Guyana, but around the world?
You're quite correct. Torture is an offense in our municipal law, that is our national law, but it is also called a crime of international jurisdiction. Okay. In fact, it's a crime against humanity. Mm-hmm. And if a person is accused of torture in one country, for example, Trinidad, he could be arrested in Barbados or Antigua or elsewhere, or even the United States, and tried for the crime. So it's an international crime. It's like genocide. Once you are accused of genocide, once you are alleged to have committed genocide, you could be tried anywhere. So, as you might notice, people in Yugoslavia or Sri Lanka or Cambodia who have committed crimes of genocide could be tried in The Hague, in Paris or elsewhere. So people accused of committing torture in Guyana are running a very, very serious risk. They're not just dealing with the Guyana courts, they're not just dealing with the magistrates court, they're dealing with the international judicial system. So you're quite right, torture is a crime of international jurisdiction, a crime against humanity.
Before I talk about what a Partnership for National Unity wants to do to solve the problem, I must ask you this, sir, and this is not only about persons members of the Guyana Police Force being accused of torturing citizens. Why do you believe that we seem to have become such a violent society? And I'm specifically focusing on the fact that a member of the Guyana Police Force was accused of using a condom and a baton to, rape a citizen. Why have we become so violent? Why do we think it is okay to do that to somebody?
Well, the incident to which you refer, which I believe is the Colvin Harding incident, occurred around the middle of November 2013. So it's been the better part of 10 weeks. But it wasn't the first. Okay. I do pray that it is the last, it will be the last, but one of the reasons why I believe that incident occurred is that previous incidents were never thoroughly investigated and the person was never punished. So the perpetrator probably felt he could have gotten away with it. And we have had a long history of torture, and a Partnership for National Unity will be going to the National Assembly to call for a debate or a discussion. The debate really in Parliament, you don't have discussions on this issue. Since 2007, at least 7 years ago, we've had a series of reports, and it is my view that many of these reports arose out of the situation in the country at the time, the security situation, which I call the Troubles. That is, there was violence by the phantom gangs who were going through the country, arresting, seizing, kidnapping, killing young boys, and some of them were tortured. The police and the army too were alleged to have tortured persons. As you know, weapons were stolen from the Guyana Defense Force, and persons who they felt were culpable or who at that time were responsible for the security of the weapons were arrested and tortured. There's evidence of torture. Persons were photographed in the newspapers, in news reports carried stories of persons being tortured, displaying their wounds and injuries, and no single investigation at the level of the state was conducted. So, in answer to your question, Malika, I would say that the failure of the People's Progressive Party Civic Administration to conduct independent inquiries into allegations of torture seemed to have created an environment in which other officers and soldiers felt it was okay, I'm not going to be punished, and they went ahead. So that is one of the reasons. But it was during this difficult security period, what I call the Troubles, roughly between 2001 and 2010, that decade, when Mr. Barrett Jagdeo was president, that we had probably a large number of torture cases.
You did say, and you touched on it a bit just now, and I know in weeks gone by, the People's National Congress Reform would have put out a statement out there saying that you would investigate almost every incident of torture within the last 20 years. My concern is, sir, are you concerned that you may have a problem in terms of accuracy in investigating those cases of torture? 20 years is a long time.
I'm not worried about accuracy because an allegation is an allegation. So it would be improper to say that every case in which there is an allegation, there is necessarily a conviction. We need evidence, and that is the purpose of the inquiry, to find out whether there is evidence to support the allegations. And if the inquiry finds such evidence, people can be brought before the courts. But right now we do not know. So if persons claim they were tortured, let them come before the Commission of Inquiry, give evidence, and if, as the lawyers say, they use their language, prima facie case is made out, then we'll find out who is the officer, who is the policeman who is alleged to have committed the crime, and we take action. The point I'd like to make is that 20 years or however long, unless we demonstrate at the level of the state that we are against torture and that we are prepared to punish torturers, we will allow the crime to continue. Now let us look at another case. You mentioned the Calvin Harding case. Let us look at the Twain Thomas case, which occurred on West Demerara, the Leonora police station. Now this young man, I think at that time he was probably 15 years old, was accused of having murdered a People's Progressive Party regional vice chairman, a former regional vice chairman. And presumably because it was a high-ranking member of the PPP, it was perceived that, there was no restriction on the actions taken by the police force to get to the killer, to find who was behind it. And that is when they used methylated spirits to roast the anatomy of this youngster. So there is a heavy political content in torture. It is not purely rogue cops. These are policemen who feel that they're carrying out some sort of political mandate and that they have license to torture. So that is the part of the torture that we need to bear in mind, that this is not just policemen and criminals. Some of these people are not criminals at all. Some of these people are innocent, but APNU says we should use legitimate instruments of investigation and interrogation to discover who's guilty. Torture in no country should be tolerated, and much less torture against your own citizens. It's reprehensible.
I'm going to come back to what you mentioned, instruments of interrogation and investigation, but before I talk about that, sir, do we need international assistance not only to investigate but to solve the problem of torture in Guyana?
We need political will on the part of our own government. I would say right now that I have not seen a single case in which we need international investigation. What we need is a group of politicians, particularly those in the government, particularly those in the executive, who are prepared to conduct investigation. We need a judiciary and a magistracy which does not fear the politicians. We need policemen in the CID, in general duties, who are not afraid of the politicians. You see, the PPP over the last 20 years has been able to drive fear into many of the persons who are responsible for enforcing the law. And I do not think that we need people from overseas to come and tell us what to do or how to investigate. What we need is a government which keeps its hands off the police force, allows the police to do its work, keeps its hands off the magistracy, keeps its hands out of the law enforcement process, so that we can make Guyana a lawful country. Right now it's lawless. That is why we had cases like Colvin Harding. That's why we had cases like the Twain Thomas case in Leonora.
Sir, do you honestly believe that there are probably policemen, whether senior or junior police officers, who take orders from meddling, if you want to call it that, politicians, and they would be afraid to not carry out these orders, these so-called orders from these politicians?
Well, I don't have evidence of that, but in the case of Twain Thomas, because of the fact that the murder victim was a high-ranking member of the People's Progressive Party, I get the impression that the investigators at the Leonora station felt that they had license to go after the alleged killers, and there were no holds barred. Nobody tried to stop them.
Upon this, coming back to what you mentioned earlier, instruments and procedures for interrogating and investigating a suspect. Upon entering the Guyana Police Force, whether it be the Guyana Police Force or the GDF, the Guyana Defense Force, are these young officers given a certain mandate and training as to how to carry out investigating certain crimes in a way that torture would not be involved?
I would expect so. As I said at the beginning of this program, as you said at the beginning of this program, torture is a crime against humanity. I mean, people ought not to have to be instructed about torture, but certainly it's against the convention. There's a convention against inhuman treatment. There is a law against torture in Guyana, and I would expect that every entrant into the defense force or the police force would be instructed against the use of torture. In the case of the defense force, they may be involved in hostile operations with a neighboring country, and we don't expect our soldiers, if they're captured, to be, tortured, and we don't expect to torture people who we capture. Similarly, the police force, they deal with criminals, they don't deal with foreign nationals necessarily. There's no justification whatsoever for torture.
Have our human rights and religious bodies done enough to, in a sense, not only speak out, but to address this matter of torture, to fight against it, to ensure that the public gets it, that, look, this is illegal?
Yes, I think the Guyana Human Rights Association has been quite forthright. There are other civil organizations, for example, the Red Thread organization is very active in the Colvin Harding case, and I saw photographs with nuns, Christian nuns, who came out to protest the Twain Thomas case 7 years ago. So I think civil society is outraged by these reports of torture, but what seems to be strange is that the government doesn't seem to be outraged. And let me tell you, this is not an anecdote, a funny anecdote. In 2008, when the People's National Congress reform was able to bring the matter of torture to debate in the National Assembly, well, I must mention that when the incident occurred, the speaker at that time, Mr. Ralph Ramkran, refused to allow the matter to be debated as a definite matter of urgent public importance. Eventually, the PNC brought a motion, which was defeated because the PPP used a majority, but one particular minister rose in the National Assembly and actually said that torture had not occurred. What happened was roughing up. Can you imagine? A minister of the government, instead of showing concern that a crime had been committed and that persons were actually injured, he said there was no torture, it was roughing up. And this is what I believe has failed Guyanese, that the government itself is not prepared to accept that the crime of torture was actually committed. And that is one of the reasons, if I can come back to an early statement you made, that is one of the reasons why torture continues. That the government itself does not believe that torture occurred.
Staying in a sense on roughing up, what would you say to not only maybe PPP politicians or even some members of the Guyana police force who may want to say that there are criminals out there, especially the ones who would probably break into someone's home and murder and steal? What would you say to a public or a particular person who may say that, look, you know, he or she deserves whatever he gets in terms of torture? How would you handle a statement like that?
Nobody deserves to be tortured. We're living in a law-governed society, and we're living by the principle that a person must be presumed to be innocent until he's proven to be guilty. So if a person's arrested, what is the point of torture? A, you may arrest the wrong person, which is quite possible. B, if you've ever suffered extreme pain, people would say anything. If you say, you know, is the chair red, white, or blue, you tell me what color you want me to say, and I repeat it, you know. Because the pain is so intense that people will say anything. And you can force confessions out of persons undergoing torture. Very frequently, once there is torture, magistrates do not accept the testimony because the testimony was given on the pain, on the duress. So it is foolhardy to conduct torture because, you know, you are unlikely to get the truth. So sometimes people even die on the torture. We had cases during what they call the Troubles, in which persons were found with their hands bound and with violent marks around their bodies. In one case, I think the eyes were gouged out. A man was shot at the back of his head. These were executions which had been done on persons. So when people are being tortured, the pain is so intense that they are likely to say anything, which means that the information they provide might very well be unreliable. And people who conduct torture may use that information to go out and hunt down other people. So it is a disease that spreads, and more people are likely to be tortured. Not fewer, not less, but more. So it doesn't work. And in my experience, I believe that many persons who are likely to have been innocent could be arrested and tortured.
Sir, I know a Partnership for National Unity in the past would have brought a no confidence motion against Mr. Clement Rohi, Home Affairs Minister. Now, Mr. Rohi in recent days more or less admitted that he's no expert on security and he doesn't have all the answers. Would torture, because it's still happening, we're talking about 20 years ago and people are still being tortured allegedly by members of the Guyana Police Force. Do you believe that torture falls within the bracket of his statement where he said that he's not an expert on security because nothing is being done to address it?
Well, he's right about that. He's not an expert. But a minister does not necessarily have to be an expert. A minister is responsible for policy direction. In fact, the law, in this case the Police Act, prevents him from giving operational orders to police officers, policemen. And that is the source of some problem, because recently on the quarantine, he instructed that the officers who were alleged to have been involved in a certain matter be transferred. And the police commissioner, instead of saying, you don't give me orders, you give me policy directions and I follow those directions, but you can't tell me who to transfer and who to promote. The commission did not respond correctly, and we will deal with that another time. But coming back to Mr. Rohi, he certainly is not an expert, but he knows, or he should receive, or he should issue policy directions which ensure that a legal framework is preserved. And if there's any attempt to have to break the law on the part of an organization or institution for which he is responsible, for example, the police, the prison, or the fire services, he should ensure that there's a commission of inquiry. So he has failed, because the Twain Thomas case occurred and he made comments. He made comments which I believe are prejudicial, and I'm waiting for a commission of inquiry, because the comments that Mr. Rohi made will be brought into evidence. He actually said the police crossed the line. Now, if he knew that the police crossed the line, why didn't he cause them to be punished? If the line had been crossed, the line that he's referring to was the line of law. And there's a direct quote in which Rohi says police crossed the line. If they crossed the line, they should have been punished. And they haven't been punished. So, Mr. Rohi is accountable to the National Assembly, to Parliament, for the way the police force behaves. We do not want to see the Commissioner of Police in the Parliament. The Commissioner of Police cannot come to the Parliament and address us. He's not an MP. It's the Minister who must hold responsibility. And if the police force misbehaves, the Minister must walk. And Rohi has been a Minister for 8 years, responsible for public security. And this will be his 22nd year in the cabinet, 22 years. Next to Prime Minister Samuel Hines, Clement Rohi is the longest serving Minister of Government. So regardless of his lack of expertise, he ought to be knowledgeable and he ought to prevent criminal behavior like the one we're seeing.
So I'd eventually like to talk about psychological assistance of persons who would have been tortured and even their relatives and friends. But before I go there, how should a public deal with a member of the Ghana Police Force or a member of the Ghana Defense Force who would have been accused of torture, and instead of being completely taken off of the force, you're transferred? How should the public deal with that? Aren't people going to be afraid in terms of dealing with such a police officer or police officers?
Well, the whole system of transferring recalcitrant and delinquent police officers is reprehensible. Because if you have a rotten orange, what are you going to do with it? A rotten orange is a rotten orange, a rotten egg is a rotten egg. There's not much you can do with a rotten egg. And if a policeman commits a serious offense like torture, which I said is one of them, it's ranked with genocide and other international crimes, that policeman has to be brought before the court and punished if he's found guilty. So there is no transfer, there's no wrapping the knuckles, there's no warning. He must feel the full force of the law. And this has not been happening. That's why torture continues in Guyana.
Right. Sir, we've had names like Victor Jones, Patrick Sumner, Michael Dunn, Chaka Chase, Twayon Thomas, and of course most recently Colwyn Harding. Now, the effects of torture for those who, fortunately, for those who survive it, is Guyana supplying, or I should say if the Ministry of Human Services has done that in terms of counseling and coaching the relatives of these people and people who themselves have been tortured, in terms of rehabilitating them, getting them to function as normal as they did before they were tortured?
I have not heard of that. I don't know whether a program exists or not. I do know that after the Lusignan massacre 8 years ago, thereabouts, there was an attempt, or there was a program by which a psychiatrist actually conducted counseling for the relatives of victims and even those who had been injured but not killed in the massacre. I thought that was quite commendable, but I do not know if other persons have had that type of counseling. And you're quite right, it's probably a blind spot in law enforcement, but I'm sure that it would be good to implement a system by which people could receive counseling. Yes.
Possible consequences of these people not counseled and their families, especially if they have small children, what could possibly happen?
Well, again, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but what I would say is that there might be feelings of revenge. There might be feelings of revenge, and people may go out and try to hurt the people who hurt them. Secondly, it could alter their own perception of relations with other persons. They could feel, hey, it's been done to me, I could do it to others. If I have information or I have something that I want to get, or they have something I want to get from them, I can, use extreme pain some form of corporal punishment. A man who is being tortured may change his attitude to his wife. His wife refuses to prepare meals on time or spend too much money. He ties her to the bed and tortures her. So there have been instances like that. You want to know, where is this behavior coming from? It comes from the state. It comes from state-sponsored violence. So it can have a knock-on effect on interpersonal relations, particularly making those relations more violent than before. Because torture now seems to be, I wouldn't say second nature, but it seems to be a device that is permitted by the state. So why not bring it down? Why not maybe some gangster who is owed money by some person, catches the person and tortures the person? This is what actually happened during the Troubles. It is alleged that there was a place in a certain street in Georgetown that was used as a torture chamber. And persons were taken to that torture chamber and tortured.
Could corporal punishment in schools, I know we're not discussing that, but could that possibly contribute to the practice of torture when a person gets older?
Yes. Torture used to be permitted in days gone by, well, many centuries gone by. I think during a period what is called the Inquisition, persons who were regarded as heretics or non-believers in God in Spain, what is called the Spanish Inquisition, were tortured. And torture was a tool of the law enforcement agencies many years ago, but we've changed, we are more civilized, and it is no longer permissible. But I would say that corporal punishment belongs to the past. Many people living today got whipped in school, but they got whipped at home. But we are grown-ups now. We can use other means, persuasion, and other means to persuade children, youngsters, not to commit offenses again. At one time, when I was growing up, there used to be an instrument called the cat o' nine tails. Well, the cat of nine tails, that's what they used to call it, the cat o' nine tails. And it was made up of leather, and it must have had 9 tongues. And people would be stripped and beaten inside the Georgetown prison. Within recent memory, there are people living today who were beaten with that. So you could go in prison and, particularly for committing certain types of offenses, you could be whipped. But that is now being classified as inhuman and degrading. So I would say that corporal punishment in schools is a device which was used in the past, but it is no longer a means of educating children. It's a means of perpetuating violence, means of making violence perpetual, because persons who've been beaten at home or at school are very likely to beat their children when they become parents.
Finally, sir, APNU's role in addressing it. You did say earlier that you would, the Commission of Inquiry, you've already called for a Commission of Inquiry. What next? What's the next steps for APNU in terms of investigating cases of torture in our country?
Well, as an opposition party, there are lots of limitations because, of course, the government's got the funds, government has got the personnel, government has got the resources. But we have to press the government to use the resources of the state to conduct these inquiries and bring an end to the scourge. We are convinced that the number of cases that you yourself have recalled only occurred because we did not nip it in the bud. We did not stop torture when we heard the first report. So it happened that further along the line, rather than conducting careful investigations by the CID and other agencies, they resorted to pouring methylated spirits on the anatomy of a youngster in the hope that he would talk. Well, anybody on extreme pain tends to talk after time. But that's not the way to go because, I said, people can say things which are untrue. So APNU, as a part of the opposition, will continue to maintain pressure on the executive, on the government, to bring this scourge to an end and to protect our children, our citizens from inhuman punishment.
Thank you very much, sir. Well said. Leader of the People's National Congress Reform and Leader of the Opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. This has been another edition of The Public Interest. We were discussing torture. Until next time, I'm Malika Ramsey. Thanks for watching.